Oh, okay.
Well, I welcome everybody to today's Rotary Club of New York meeting. As I said, it is May 26, 2022. We have a very fascinating speaker here today, Franz Sedelmayer from München, Germany. He's going to talk about his book, Welcome to Putingrad, and you will have the opportunity to ask many questions about Putin and anything else Russia. So with that said, I will introduce you to Audrey Levine, our pianist, for the Star Spangled Banner. Thank you. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you very much. Since we have to adjourn punctually today, we ask our president now, Gerard Triffin, to introduce our guest speaker and opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Rotary Club of New York, Host Club of America, and to all of our friends around the world. Today, we have a very distinctive and special guest on a very timely topic. As you will remember, in the past month or so, we've had a number of broadcasts from Rotary clubs in Kyiv, in Lviv, in Warsaw. We've spoken to a legislator from the parliament in Ukraine. And today we are honored to have with us Mr. Franz Sedelmayer, who has a unique perspective, unique knowledge of Vladimir Putin and Russia. He is CEO of the US-based Multinational Asset Recovery Campaign, MARC, which specializes in international dispute resolution. He is the author of the book, which Andreas mentioned to you, Welcome to Putingrad, which was published in 2017, which is a memoir of his time in Russia and his case against Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation. He serves as a trustee, director, and consultant for companies and individuals involved in litigation and claim recovery against sovereigns, state-owned enterprises, and foreign debtors, pardon me. After graduating from higher education, he served in German armed forces, and early in his career became the dealer in security equipment. And in 1989, at the age of 26, moved to Russia and formed a joint company venture, Kamani Ostrov Company, with the USSR Ministry of Interior, and in Leningrad City worked with the Leningrad Regional Police Department to supply law enforcement equipment, and worked with the deputy mayor of St. Petersburg at the time, Vladimir Putin. He's the founder of the St. Petersburg International Business Association, served as advisor to numerous government agencies, provided security services for Western financial institutions, large investors, diplomatic corps. Interestingly, in 1996, his holdings were expropriated by Boris Yeltsin to be converted into a presidential vacation residence, dacha. He pursued a settlement through ad hoc arbitration through an existing German-Russian bilateral investment cooperation treaty. And proud to say, for him, he actually prevailed in his arbitration award, his suit against the Russian Federation, and received the first international arbitration award against Russia. And to date, I think is probably the only one in this situation. He's prevailed in over 100 cases against Russia in European public courts and arbitration tribunals, and is the only individual who has actually collected on a claim from a sovereign debtor. He has been the central focus of international media, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Economist, Der Spiegel, Deutsche Zeitung, Bild, Reuters, Dow Jones, etc., has appeared numerous times on television broadcasts and interviews. It's our honor to present to you today, and to all of our guests, Rotary around the world who will be watching with us now and later on in our recordings, Franz Sedelmayer. Good afternoon, Mr. Sedelmayer. Franz, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for having me. First time I do a talk for the Rotary Club. Very nice meeting you. Anyway, let's talk a little bit about Vladimir Putin. I think that man is on everybody's mind at the moment. We in the West have had problems understanding what his motivations are to do what he's currently doing. And there's a little, what the Russians call an anecdote. When Vladimir Putin says, "I want peace," he also says, "I want peace of Ukraine, I want peace of Moldova, I want peace of Poland." I mean, of course, that's a joke, but it pretty much tells us that what he has said on many occasions to a Western audience, and we all concentrated on the first part of the message and conveniently left out the second part. And everyone in the West tried to see the good in Russia and the good in Mr. Putin, and what they thought was his strategy overall. Going back to Mr. Putin's early days, when he was a KGB agent in Dresden, when you read back over the last 22, 23, 24 years, you will see that Mr. Putin is being described a little bit like a James Bond from the days in the KGB. I mean, you can still see him being portrayed by his own propaganda, riding around half naked on a horse, and other pictures which make him look like a very, very strong, very resilient person. The truth of his career and what he was specializing in is a little bit more profane than that. Mr. Putin was responsible for two things in Dresden. Number one, he was a recruiter. That is, he was recruiting information sources for the KGB. Dresden in East Germany, still under communist rule, was the commercial center for East Germany's international relations in business. They had a couple of trade shows that were well attended also by Westerners. So Mr. Putin was recruiting both people from the West, and he was recruiting also people from East Germany to serve as information sources. The other thing that he did, he was watching the East German opposition. So when he had the larger demonstrations going on, the East Germans, of course, arrested people. And when they arrested people, they also made a point in interviewing people that they had arrested. And one of the interviewers was Vladimir Putin in the day. Mr. Putin, after the wall came down, actually was forced to retire from the KGB because it turned out that the statistics of recruitment, the numbers of people that he recruited, he reported back to Moscow, were not exactly accurate, but they were exaggerated. And somebody actually went into the lists of recruitment and found that the people he recruited were already on the payroll, most of them for the Stasi, for the East German Staatssicherheit, or their version of, or the East German version of the KGB. So he came back to Leningrad and became a assistant to a professor by the name of Anatoly Sobchak, who was a law professor at the University of Leningrad in the day. He also was an unofficial agent of the KGB. He was one of the few people who could travel rather freely. But he also ran for mayor in St. Petersburg and ended up being elected as the first democratically elected mayor of Leningrad. And Putin, of course, went with him. And when I started my company, which was a joint venture with the local police department, I had some partner problems initially, which is not untypical for the time. After I placed my investment, the deputy chief of the police of Leningrad tried to convince me to leave Russia because I had done enough, and he would gladly take over my assets. Of course, I didn't want to take that laying down. And I went to the US consulate because we had a US company in those days that was partner in that joint venture. And Jack Gosnell, who was then the consul general of the United States in Leningrad, said, you know what, maybe you should go and talk to Putin. He has a soft spot for the Germans. And that's exactly what I did. I had somebody make an appointment for me, went in there with my translator, sat down, and saw a very determined man. He wasn't very big as far as his size was concerned, but he had a very firm handshake. He had made eye contact. You know, he was interested in being taken seriously. He had absolute manners. We sat down, and my translator started translating what I had to say, and after 30 seconds, he raised his arm and said, stop, I speak German, and I prefer to speak German with you directly. And that's what we did. He looked at his watch from time to time. He looked at the ceiling from time to time. He gave you all the message in a way. They had better things to do than to deal with me at the moment, which, by the way, is something I can deal with because that's exactly how a German bureaucrat would behave. And when he started speaking German, of course, that picture became complete for me. But the essence of the conversation was surprising because Mr. Putin basically told me flat out he would not be able to, pardon me, involve himself in a business dispute, as he put it, between partners. And my question to him was, well, since you're the man in the city responsible for foreign investment, and are you not interested in having other investors come into the city and not have problems with partners, especially when they're partners that are state institutions? And he said, no. He says, that's not my problem. My problem is to keep my mayor happy and to keep my mayor safe. So we said goodbye. I told him that it won't be the last time he will see me. And I went out and I tried to investigate what he meant by his last sentence, so to speak. And I found out that Putin's main function was to serve as a connector between the mayor, Sobchak, and the different organs of state, be it the police, the tax police, the prosecutor's office, the courts, etc. And the reason the mayor needed that type of a communication link is because he was absolutely corrupt. There was hardly a business in Leningrad in those days who could open shop involving some type of public interest. I mean, imagine in Russia just coming out as a economy, everything, all economic interests anywhere in the city, all real estate, etc., was state-owned. So it was impossible to do anything without some involvement with a local partner or the state itself. Knowing that, I understood quickly what is going on. Over time, we developed a very good working relationship. I built a SWAT team for the city of St. Petersburg for the Goodwill Games, pro bono. Putin and I had a very good relationship. He came to my house every once in a while, where we also had our office. He liked Bavarian food and Bavarian beer. We conversed in German, but it was very interesting to sit down and talk. And I found out several things about Putin, which surprised me a little bit. First of all, he was not upset about the breakup of the Soviet Union at all. He thought that was just a logical consequence of what was taking place around Russia in those days. Secondly, he was very much for market economy. And thirdly, he had no ideology to speak of. He was very pragmatic. Also, he was not religious. I mean, when you see pictures today, you think he's going to church 3 times a day, which probably he should after what he's done with Ukraine. But he was a very straightforward person. And the topics of discussion that we had revolved about politics, about history, about where he thinks the country is going, about the current problems, which of course had a lot to do with crime and with violence. I mean, so Leningrad, St. Petersburg in the early 90s was the murder capital of Russia, if not the Soviet Union. But essentially, he was actually famous in the circles for 2 things. Number one, he was not corrupt himself. He would not ask for anything, and he would also not accept anything from anyone. And the second thing was his unwavering loyalty to his mayor. And that unwavering loyalty paid off when Mayor Sobchak in 1996 was not reelected and out of a job. And out of a job also was Vladimir Putin. And when my expropriation took place, that was done by a presidential decree by Boris Yeltsin, Putin was the one to break the news to me that I had been expropriated. And we sat down with Michael Manievich and others, and the whole thing was that the expropriation was about to happen, and now it's a matter of how we deal with it. So Vladimir Putin offered me real estate owned by the city of St. Petersburg on the very same island I was in Kamennyi Ostrov, or what we call the Stony Islands. And he said, the problem is the city has no money for any leasehold improvements, for any investments you have there. And I said, well, that doesn't surprise me. So I asked him, I said, who is responsible for the expropriation from the president's office? And it turned out to be Pavel Borodin, who was the head of the Upravlenie Delami Prezidenta Rossiyskoj Federacji, which is more or less the presidential administration of economic affairs. And so we sat down, Vladimir and I, and we drafted a half-page letter where I described how much money I invested, was something like $890,000 in leasehold improvements, and that the city would furnish me with another piece of real estate. And based on my claim for leasehold improvements, we could make arrangements to move out. And then 10 days later, a letter came back from Pavel Borodin, and it said, very straightforward, it said, there will be no compensation forthcoming. This company, meaning us, the Kamennyi Ostrov company, was established illegally, which is sort of funny in a way, because Vladimir Putin was the one who registered my company. So it was, of course, legal. But it just was a matter of routine for the Russian state. They like to take things, but they don't like to pay any compensation. And that brought us to a situation where we had to go to Stockholm to start an arbitration under the reciprocal investment treaty between the USSR and Germany, Russia being the successor state of the USSR. And I was the first one to win this case. And then, of course, I expected that Russia will pay up because, of course, they're interested in foreign investment, rule of law, whatever makes them attractive. And to my surprise, then I learned that the Russians really don't worry about their reputation. This is all secondary. When it comes to paying money, they're not ready to do it. If you have someone from the Kremlin deal with people like me over issues of money, that person is cursing his life every single day, because if he goes too soft on things like that, or even would suggest to make a payment, his career is over. If he loses the cases, which they did many with us, then his career is over too. So it's a no-win situation for whichever bureaucrat is handling this. But when we started the arbitration, at our very first meeting, I got to talk to the Russian lawyers. They sent two ladies from Moscow, and I said, who do you work for in Moscow? Because we knew many people at the time. So she says, I work for Vladimir Putin. Turns out Mr. Putin, after the elections were lost for Mr. Sobchak, was recruited by Pavel Borodin, who he worked with on my expropriation. So he took over the international department for the Upravlenie Delami, and then was appointed the head of the FSB, or what was called at that time the Ministry of Security, which is nothing but the successor organization of the KGB. In his days in the KGB, of course, the Yeltsins appointed him for a purpose. The reason they appointed him is the whole family of Mr. Yeltsin, including his daughter and his son-in-law, were investigated for graft, for corruption. Turns out that the organization, the Upravlenie Delami Presidenta, that is the people who expropriated me, awarded a contract for renovation of the Kremlin and other artifacts and architectural sites in Russia to a Swiss company called Marbitex. The Swiss company was owned by an Albanian citizen, and they paid $60 million to the Yeltsin family as a kickback. And they did it rather openly. So the Yeltsins went ahead and opened a bank account in Switzerland, and all the credit cards they used were in their own names. So somebody in Switzerland had second thoughts about it. It was reported to the Prosecutor General of Switzerland. And then the General Prosecutor of Russia, a gentleman by the name of Skuratov, initiated a case based on that information. So the Yeltsins, of course, tried to squash the investigation. So Mr. Putin came in handy. He came with a reputation and made him the head of KGB. And before long, 2-3 months later, Mr. Skuratov was shown, or a person that looked like him was shown on national TV, on the 8 o'clock news, where he was in a hotel room with two ladies doing whatever he was doing at the time. And it caused such a scandal that Mr. Skuratov had to resign. And not only did he have to resign, they also started a criminal case against him because he accepted 2 tailor-made suits from the Upravlenie Delami Presidenta. That's the organization who was responsible for my expropriation. And he did not pay for it. Of course, Mr. Skuratov was not on the take. The Upravlenie Delami was responsible to cater to any bureaucrat, to any judge, to any prosecutor, to anyone in the organs of state that had a certain level. And they would provide their car, they would provide their drivers, they would provide apartments and summer houses, they would provide them with staff, they would take care of their health care. If they were traveling, they would get them tickets for flights, they would house them in their hotels, etc. So it's a full service for employees of the Russian state. And Mr. Skuratov, of course, had to resign. The investigation was squashed and went away. And as we all know, Mr. Yeltsin then ran for re-elections. Mr. Yeltsin could not run for another election for a 3rd term because that was outlawed by the Russian Constitution. So he was looking for someone, for a successor. So he looked at people like Nemtsov, who, of course, had a reputation for not being corrupt. And nobody wanted to do one thing for the Yeltsin family, and that is to give them amnesty from anything they were involved with before Mr. Yeltsin would leave office. The only one that offered that solution was Mr. Putin. So he put him in first as prime minister, where Putin began a campaign against Chechnya, which the prelude was that 4 apartment buildings exploded in the middle of the night. Several ones were up in Moscow, and I think one was in another city, killed hundreds of people, and it was blamed on the Chechen. There's still dispute going on if it really was the Chechen, and people now suspect it was actually done by the KGB to create a pretense for going to war against Chechnya, which was their second campaign, because the first campaign the Russians had lost very badly. And in December of 1999, Mr. Yeltsin made Putin the interim president until such time as new elections could be held, which were then held, I believe, in March of the year 2000. And what Mr. Putin had done very cleverly, he used the Chechen campaign and was on the front every single day and was on Russian television, state television, and all the newspapers, etc., 24/7. And he portrayed what the Russians were really looking for, a strong leader. A leader that was not just promising victory in Chechnya, but also was promising to end corruption, who was promising to end crime, etc. So they were looking for a strong person, and Mr. Putin seemed to foot the bill. So with the pop elections that he won with some 56%, he became president. And actually, many people, and that included me, we expected Mr. Putin to be good for the country. And there's this one scene when people ask today, right after he invaded Ukraine, all our politicians that were dealing with Mr. Putin on a personal level said something happened to him, he changed. Well, the problem with that picture is Mr. Putin did not change 3 or 4 months ago, around the time he went into Ukraine. He changed when he became president, when he was elected. And there's this scene of the Yeltsin family, and it's actually in a documentary film. Mr. Yeltsin, his daughter-in-law, his wife, his grandkids, they're all sitting in a living room, all watching the elections. And then it turns out that Mr. Putin had won the elections as president. And then Boris Yeltsin gets up and says, I have to call Vladimir Vladimirovich. I have to congratulate him. So he picks up the phone, tells the receptionist to connect him, and then stands there, and he puts down the phone and says, Vladimir Vladimirovich is busy. The fact is that Mr. Yeltsin and Mr. Putin, after that day, never exchanged another word. It was like switching, flipping a switch, like a light switch. Mr. Putin now was in charge. What does that mean? Mr. Putin brought his entourage from St. Petersburg, the people that he worked with in Smolny, that is the mayor's office of Leningrad, St. Petersburg. He brought many of his friends and contacts out of the KGB that he came up with. And one thing they did immediately, they occupied all the key positions. And the key positions initially was positions in the Kremlin, positions in the Russian government under the prime minister, and of course in all of the organs of state, of course the FSB, the intelligence service, the SVR, the GRU, and of course the armed forces. One thing they did not do immediately was to take control of the economy until Michael Khodorkovsky came along, because Putin's reasoning was, I can dictate to the business what will happen in Russia. And when Mr. Khodorkovsky and other oligarchs started to challenge that, Mr. Putin made an example of Mr. Khodorkovsky. There was a meeting in the Kremlin with all the oligarchs at a round table, where Mr. Khodorkovsky, who was in the process to sell his company Yukos, oil company Yukos, which the assets of Yukos now are used by Rosneft, the largest oil company in the world. Mr. Khodorkovsky criticized the corruption that takes place in business. And he criticized in veiled words the fact that many in Putin's entourage are asking for kickbacks. That really was the message. To which Mr. Putin replied, well, I would like to know how you are paying your taxes, because Yukos, like many other companies, took advantage of a tax code that was still written by Boris Yeltsin, which allowed them to declare their profit offshore, in other words, outside Russia. So that was not illegal. It was nice, but it was done just like it's done in many Western countries, even though that is supposed to come to an end eventually. So that was the situation. And next thing you know, Mr. Khodorkovsky was arrested when he was refueling his private jet somewhere in Siberia. So a van pulled up with a bunch of FSB guys in SWAT gear, and they just dragged him off the airplane. And Mr. Khodorkovsky spent the next 10 years or so in jail. So everybody, the oligarchs and everyone in Russia understood that Putin put his foot down. Yukos was auctioned off for alleged tax debts and was bought by a company that had offices registered in Tyumen in the oil region, somewhere in a basement. And they bought the Yukos assets for literally less than a cent on the dollar. And then Rosneft, which was a government-owned oil company, bought the assets from that buyer. In other words, they tried to avoid being sued by the Yukos shareholders, because the case that happened was not a good case. It obviously was a kangaroo court that convicted Mr. Khodorkovsky, pardon me, and also decided that Yukos has to be auctioned off in lieu of tax debts. And it resulted in a very well-known arbitration case where the Yukos shareholders brought arbitration cases against the Russian Federation in the Court of Human Rights of Europe, where they ended up receiving a judgment to their benefit in the amount of $1.8 billion plus interest, and in a private arbitration court where they obtained an arbitral award in the value of $50 billion, which is the world's largest award ever given in arbitration, plus, of course, interest and costs. So that award might be worth anywhere north of 75 billion US dollars. So it goes to show that already very early on, Putin knew how to use the judiciary. He knew how to use the organs of state to make or to create an outcome that he was seeking. The West, in a way, looked on. They were initially outraged, but no one really wanted to spoil relations with a strategic partner. And so we got used to treating Russia different from how we would treat other countries that would do similar things. I mean, I'm thinking of countries like Turkey, I'm thinking of countries like Poland and Hungary. Whenever they change legislation, the European Union is all over them to make sure that they keep within European standards. These standards obviously never apply to Russia, never apply to Putin. And then what we see is an influx of billions and billions of dollars every year of money that did not come from legitimate business, but it came from graft and corruption and hostile takeovers and what have you. And that money was being taken, if you want, by people who are either in the government or the organ of states or closely associated with them. So they bring their loot to the West. And the reason they bring their loot to the West is, number one, they can invest it here, predominantly in commercial companies, in real estate. That's the two big ones. Also, of course, have some cash available to them. But why is London, Frankfurt, and New York such a great destination? Because we have working courts. We have legislation. They use our legislation to protect their stolen loot. I mean, this is quite interesting. Now, since then, of course, the West has started to clamp down on this type of transfer of illicitly obtained funds, which pose the problems for many people in Russia. Then, of course, Mr. Putin became a little bit more bold in eliminating what he viewed as enemies. Very prominent case, of course, is the polonium case that happened in London. The victim was Sasha Litvinenko. He was poisoned with a radioactive substance by the name of polonium. And in later years, we had poisonings of other opponents, and we had suicides that it's doubtful that it was suicides in Germany, in France, in the United Kingdom, etc. We have had several attacks with polonium, both in England and also poisonings that involved opposition leaders against Mr. Putin. For example, Mr. Kara-Murza, he was poisoned twice, he survived twice. We have, of course, Alexei Navalny, who survived a poisoning in Siberia. So we have a historic development where Mr. Putin first started clamping down on the government of the organs of state when he took that over as president. We then have a clamp down on the oligarchs. We have a clamp down on what we call strategic industry, oil, gas, minerals, rare earth elements, gold and diamonds, etc. And then we have a clamp down on Russia society that literally progressed from year to year. I mean, since we have the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has become as strict a state when it comes to normal citizen as was existing under Joseph Stalin after the 1920s, until he passed away in 1958, I believe it was, or well, 54, whatever. So we are in a situation now where we have a war going on. Of course, Russia invading Ukraine. We have a situation where you have up to 4 million people that are refugees. A lot of them went outside Ukraine. Some others just went west of the country. But what people have not looked at is the fact that about 1.2 million Russians have left Russia. And the people that left Russia are the backbone of the economy. These are the younger people that have families, that still have a life to live. And unfortunately, many of them left Russia, not necessarily because of the invasion of Ukraine, but because they thought this is right or wrong or whatever. The motivating factor was that they didn't want to live in a Stalinist society. So that reflects what we see inside Russia too. When you ask Russians about the what they call the special campaign against Ukraine, 80% or so the polls say, are for the special operation in Ukraine, which of course is devastating for the West, because we see that the disinformation and the propaganda that is aired every day on radio and television to the Russian population actually has an influence, where many people think this is a justified campaign. We have had a scenario now where the West is trying to imagine what can be the fallout from the Ukrainian campaign. What if or when Russia loses that campaign? And people are looking at the different circles of power in Russia. The first ones are the oligarchs. So the oligarchs are in a very, very special situation, because many of them, not all of them, by the way, have been sanctioned by the West. And that means that they cannot make use of their assets outside Russia. Their yachts are confiscated. There's a freezing order on the sale of their real estate companies, etc., etc. Some strategic companies were actually put under Western management by government orders, like in Germany happened with Gazprom-owned facilities in Germany, etc. So they can get to their money, they can pay the employees. I mean, if you have a yacht someplace, you can't even pay your mooring fees. So by law, those yachts might go up at auction at one time. Who knows? But the point is, the oligarchs are not necessarily the most courageous people that could execute or even plan a coup d'etat to get rid of Mr. Putin because he's in the way of their business. They were allowed to operate for one reason only. They were very submissive when it came to Mr. Putin and his entourage. So I don't expect any activity coming from them to overthrow Mr. Putin. The second group is Putin's entourage, and what goes for the oligarchs goes to a large extent for his entourage. They all made brilliant money when they were working in the Kremlin administration or in the prime minister's office in any given industry, including Rosneft, for example. Igor Sechin is such an example. He's the CEO of Rosneft, the largest oil company in the world. So again, they made their career because they were submissive. There's not a single person who I would deem courageous enough to go against Mr. Putin. There's a third group, though, which gives me a little bit of hope, and that's why I call the young technocrats. In 2016, Mr. Putin exchanged pretty much all key positions. So he sent his friends from the KGB and from his days in St. Petersburg. He retired most of these people, from the Secretary of Defense to many others, with the exception of the foreign minister, Lavrov, with the exception of Igor Sechin, and with the exception of his minister of defense. And he replaced the key position with younger people who are between 35 and 55 years in age. They're all hand-picked, they're all hand-trained, they're trained like Machiavelli. But since they're trained like that, they're the first ones to recognize when there's blood in the water. And there's maybe a point in time which might not be too far off, especially when Mr. Putin would lose in Ukraine decisively, that these people might be willing to do something. The problem for the West will be is that for the Russian people and for our relationship with Russia, this will not mean that there will be any positive changes. It just means that Mr. Putin would be replaced. So either scenario is not good, scenario being Mr. Putin remaining in power, which is what I would bet on at the moment, or being replaced by someone. The democratic opposition under Alexei Navalny and under Mr. Milov, who is in the West. Mr. Navalny is in a Russian prison for the next 9 years, I believe. In terms of absolute numbers, pro-opposition, there's maybe 3 to 5% of the Russian population when you actually have a physical count per se. So they're a very, very small crowd comparatively speaking. And even if Mr. Navalny would be coming out of prison today and would be made the president of Russia if there would be a popular overthrow, which I don't think is in the cards, just for the reason they cannot muster enough people in the streets today because nobody wants to go to jail for 15 years. But Mr. Navalny, whoever would come into office, has a very significant practical problem. And that practical problem is that he must replace generations of bureaucrats in the organs of states, in the Russian government, and in the Russian armed forces, and in the Russian police, and in the Russian judiciary. In order to do that, you need someone physically, numbers, to perform that task. And the democratic opposition is not yet in a position to do so, and who knows when that point in time would come. Going back to Ukraine and our position on Ukraine, we know we have put significant sanctions onto Russia when it comes to trade. Of course, the sanctions are full of holes. I, being German, I have to say to my shame that we still import gas. We still import oil. We still do business with Russia. We still deliver spare parts for the pipelines and everything else. So for Russia, this is just business as usual in many instances. So the sanctions hit Russian companies, hit Russian individuals, etc. It hasn't been hard enough to really breed any discontent at home. You know, Russians have a long collective memory. They have not lived very well for a long time. We're talking 20 years of a comfortable life. For most Russians, the life was comfortable, but not really, even compared to the West. We had a wage level under $1,000 a month for most people that you know, have to work for a living. So it was a modest middle class that emerged in Russia, and part of that middle class is now running away, of course. So we have a situation where Russia is still making money. Mind you, all the military industry that they have, building tanks, producing ammunitions, is all a ruble business. They don't need valuta. They don't need US dollars or euros to pay for that. So this is the valuta that they earn with their trade. That's the icing on the cake. Part of that goes into their pockets, obviously. Why did Russia perform so poorly in Ukraine? Well, the reason is simple. The Russian army was fleeced just as much as any other government sector in Russia by Putin and his entourage. So that when they went to war, they expected a quick victory. They expected the Ukrainians to run out of their houses and to welcome them with bread and salt. And that didn't happen. So after 3 days, they pretty much ran out of fuel for their tanks and for their vehicles. They ran out of food. And the food part I find especially interesting. They went into battle with food rations, ready to eat meals. And when they first displayed one of these rations on Ukrainian television, I looked at it and said, that does not look like it was made in Russia. And sure enough, the military rations that the Russians use were made in America, in the United States. And they expired in 2015. And to make the story round is a very typical Russian story. It was 2 Russian immigrants, American citizens, that won the contract to produce these food rations. And then they went on the radar of the FBI because they paid kickbacks to the individuals in the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation that that gave them the contract, gave them the business. So both, it was a couple. So the lady and the gentleman now spent some years in federal prison. But I think that's indicative for the whole problem. And the other problem was, and most people don't realize it, Ukrainians were the backbone of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. They were the typical non-commissioned officer was Ukrainian. So right around the time of Crimea, that backbone disappeared. There was basically a purge going to the Russian armed forces. So now you have mostly draft soldiers, which were forced to sign contracts to serve time in the Russian army from 2 years and up. And they were recruited not individually, but by the company or by the platoon. They were forced to sign. They were given marching orders by their officers who did not share what the objective was. So in many cases, with the first wave, these young guys between 18 and 22 years old, these boy chicks, as I call them, did not even know that they had invaded Ukraine. They were given maps that did not contain city names, village names, rivers, or other prominent geographical locations. And when they ran out of gas and supplies, they asked Ukrainians, the dwellers, the people that lived there, to help them. And then there's this one scene on video, which I think is very typical, where there's a stranded tank out of gas and 2 Ukrainian soldiers stopping a Lada car with a Ukrainian farmer. And they ask him for gasoline and they ask him for food. So the farmer says, I can't give you anything, but do you know where you are? And they said, we have no idea. I said, you're 70 kilometers away from Kiev. And these two young guys, they're completely freaked out. And then the Lada driver said, but if you're nice boys, I will tow your tank with my Lada cart to the Russian border. And that was the end of the video. But it describes a classical breakdown of hierarchy. It describes a distrust in the hierarchy of the Russian armed forces between their soldiers and their officers. It describes that everyone involved in this campaign, including the soldiers, understand they should not be in Ukraine. And what the West must do, and this I think it's the most important thing, what the West must do is we must support Ukraine and deliver them anything they need to win this war. And winning this war for Ukraine means is to push the Russian armed forces out of Ukrainian territory. And we cannot allow Vladimir Putin to even lay claim to the regions of Luhansk, Donetsk, Kherson, or wherever they're standing today, because any such partial victory, which some of our Western politicians, they talk about peace talks, and the peace talks involve 25% of the Ukrainian territory, which is these three regions pretty much, would fall to Russia. And if we do this, we only whet Putin's appetite for more. Which brings us to my last point. What is Putin's thinking? Why did he invade Ukraine? The reality is, every time Mr. Putin had problems in the polls with his popularity and measures that he was introducing to the Russian people that concerned their freedom, etc., Mr. Putin chose to create a conflict someplace. We have seen that in different years from the outset, when he still was prime minister, when he started the second campaign in Chechnya. We have seen that in 2008 when he invaded a territory in Georgia, an area called Abkhazia, which, by the way, now is being made part of the Russian Federation, just like Crimea was annexed by Russia. And Mr. Putin knows that whenever he goes to war, whenever there's a dispute of national proportions, then Russian people will be patriotic enough to hurtle around the flag. In other words, he will be safe for another 3 or 4 years. Mr. Putin's biggest fear is to lose office. If Mr. Putin loses office, Mr. Putin knows if he asks whoever is holding his loot, it will be cheaper to shoot Putin before paying him out the money. He knows if there's a democratic leader taking his place, he will end up in jail, and so will most of his entourage. There's no question. There is no exile for Mr. Putin to go to. I mean, he's not going to emigrate like the son of Mr. Khrushchev or the daughter of Mr. Stalin. He's still Vladimir Putin. The only place he could emigrate to is probably North Korea or China. That's about as good a choice he has. So Mr. Putin will do anything, including war, including an expansion of the Russian Federation, just to remain in power. So our job is not to allow him to succeed in Ukraine. We'll put him in a position where eventually he will have to leave office by his own accord or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Franz. We appreciate the insights you have given to us. We don't have much time left. I think you've answered it. There were a couple of questions here. Tony Blackshaw, welcome from Somerset, UK. His question was, do you think that Putin influenced the election of Patriarch Kirill as well?
Sorry, whose election?
Kirill, the metropolitan in Moscow of the church.
Kirill, I don't know if anybody knows, but Kirill is an officer of the KGB. That was in his upbringing. Okay. So he and Putin are actually colleagues. So Mr. Putin is using the Orthodox Church to support whatever he's doing, and Kirill is 100% loyalist, no question.
Do you think that Putin would ever become desperate enough to use nuclear weapons?
I cannot rule it out, but there must be a technical advantage for that. It's not enough for him to use a nuclear device to explode in a Ukrainian field, because everybody knows he has the possibility to do so. So there's no tactical advantage. The only thing I see is, the Russians are in a difficult position with the war as it is. If he would see a possibility to decapitate the Ukrainian leadership with such an action, even if it means to bring that device to Kiev, yes, there's a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Okay, even though the prevailing westerly winds would carry the radiation into Russia.
Putin does not care. People look at Putin is not a strategist. He decides. He's a little bit like Mr. Trump. When he gets angry, he decides with his stomach. He doesn't care about consequences. He has no empathy, not for his own people, and not for the Ukrainians, most certainly. So he will do whatever things he will get away with. Absolutely.
Do you think there is a future for the partnerships that you put together in the past in Russia? Can something like this happen again? The business-wise.
Business-wise, we are 20 years away from that, at least a generation. And imagine Russia like Germany after the war. It took Germany 20 years to denazify. I use that term on purpose because this denazification process that was done by the Allies that obviously won World War II, and good thing that they did. But it required two things. It required a judicial process that you could actually ask people, what did you do during Hitler's days? What did you have a party affiliation? Were you in a public office? Explain who you were. And then this would be processed through the courts, and if there would be doubts, there would be trials. But it still took 20 years to convince most Germans that what Germany did was wrong in World War II. And what Germany did to the other peoples, including Jewish people, was absolutely not just wrong, it was a crime of unspeakable proportions. And in a way, we see this, the initial forms, I wouldn't call it genocide with Ukraine, but if to identify an enemy that can be killed by describing someone that he describes himself as a Ukrainian citizen, if that's enough reason to kill someone, then we have the same foundation as if somebody has the wrong religion or the wrong race. And so we have to look at Russia that way and see also that Germany was, we had foreign troops in Germany for a reason. We needed to be made a democracy. And to do this without foreign influence in Russia is a Herculean task. And I cannot see that done, be honest with you. And if we were to improve that with Russia, so they actually observe human rights and democratic principles, this is a long, long process. And we have to spend a lot of energy and money and communications with the Russian people and whoever leadership will come after Mr. Putin. But this is not a process that will go overnight. And I hate to disappoint any business. And I've been there. I know what it means to lose your business in Russia. And I love my Russian people. My wife is Russian. We have 2 kids. We are married now 29 years. And I can tell you, it's really, it weighs on us not to be able to visit Russia even. But the point is, if you want a better Russia, you have to see the realities, and trade and exchange with the Russia of today. I don't think it's even possible.
Well, you've answered about 3 or 4 questions that were posed exactly in that area, and I would have to agree. I think you're right. There's a whole new set of rules, and as an investor, would you be willing to put your investments into a place like Russia today, knowing that, well, you've been expropriated, so you know what it feels like. So, is McDonald's or Starbucks or someone willing to go back and do that again? And I think you've answered that question quite well. Yep. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you everyone for being with us today. I think this was fascinating. That you've given us a lot. You've answered a lot of questions that people have, given us insight into the Russian psyche, which unfortunately the Americans in the West, I don't think, understand. I think you would agree with me. The Russian psyche is quite different from ours.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and our homework as Westerners, as Americans, is to study other people and understand them. Rotary is one of a great help in this because we can connect with people around the world through Rotary and hear the other side of the story and learn things that never occurred to us before, that we're not taught here. And I think we're to blame for this. Again, understanding the Russian psyche, understanding the Chinese psyche is an important thing for the West to do. That's our homework. That's our task. Thank you so much, Franz. We look forward to being with you again. Thank you for your time today. Thank you, everyone, for joining with us. And all be safe. We will see you again next week.
Thank you very much.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Ja, alles Gute.
Vielen Dank für alles. Ja.
Ihnen.